Hello, everybody. This is Jon Arnold of Arnold Associates, and I am back with Chris Fine. Hey, Chris.
Hi, John. Good to be back.
Okay, and yes, we're off and running with another of our monthly podcasts, Watch This Space. And as always, we've got new stuff to talk about because it never ends. And 2020 is probably a good starting point to look ahead beyond just the day-to-day, new decade, etc. And we covered a bit of that in our last podcast, actually a couple of podcasts, kind of what happened in 2019 and what we think is happening in this coming year and decade. So we've got a little more of the same. Both of us have been a little bit on the road catching some events, and I know I've got a whole bunch of them lined up over the next few months, and that's just a day in the life of an analyst. So that's how it goes. But we're here, and we've got a few things to share, and I think as we've been talking, Chris, we will hit the high points of a couple of recent events, and people can always follow up if they want to hear more, but we want to keep our messaging fairly concise and make sure everyone gets good use of their time when they listen to our podcasts. Yeah, so year is off to a good start for you, Chris?
Yes, it is. It is. I'm just seeing more and more traction in a lot of the trends in space utilization and, interior office technology and real estate that we've been talking about. So I went to a conference this last week, which was pretty interesting. It was the first time I was at this conference. It was in New York. It was called Future Offices, and it was actually interesting because it was an enterprise and real estate folks for the most part, not all technicians or IT people. And it was held at Battery Park City at the offices of Convene, which is one of, I think, the more progressive and forward-looking flexible space and event management companies. And it was a beautiful space. It was very nice. But it was just interesting that a lot of traditional organizations were assembling in this type of place. And it was very much an affirmation of what you and I have been talking about where space is going and how people work and how organizations are viewing all of this. And it wasn't all just the usual innovative, ahead of the curve thinkers that you sometimes see at these things. I mean, not to say that these folks weren't, but they were pretty solidly grounded in budgets and corporate real estate and backgrounds in real estate and finance and facilities management and some IT. And what was interesting was they were all talking about the need for proactive evolution of the workplace and the technologies in the workplace, and recognizing the differences in how people work, recognizing the diversity of people in the workforce, and looking at trends as to where real estate investment is going. So it was a pretty interesting get together, John. There were a couple of takeaways I would say would be that several large companies got up there, their real estate folks got up there and said, we're moving into the downtowns. We're not going to stay out in the suburbs. We're moving to downtowns to attract the talent that has chosen to settle in a more urban environment. And the part B of that was that they were saying we're not necessarily going to go and buy or lease long-term space. We're going to go with these companies, the classic one being WeWork, but certainly they're not the only player. We're going to try to find flex space to do this, and we're not going to 100% necessarily own even how the interior architecture or fit out is done. And we're not going to necessarily take long-term leases. And this has all kinds of implications for the space that you and I talk about with technology, because if you're an IT person, the way you have to start thinking when you have flexible space is pretty different.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's like 10 things in there we could be talking about all day, and I'm sure just right off the top, just thinking about the concept of, legacy infrastructure, if you are not owning your space, it's just all the more reason to put everything in the cloud, right? I mean, everything should just be on demand, and that's what agility is all about these days, right?
Right, and part of what's driving this from a technology side is the coring out of the middle layer of servers and, local data and processing capability. It's sort of rich edge and rich cloud, and not so much the dedicated equipment that you used to find.
Yeah, so it's good news for Amazon and Google, maybe not such good news for whatever, HP, Cisco, all the hardware players, right?
I think it depends on the player. I think if you're a
Yeah.
networking company, I think if you're Cisco or HPE or any of the players, that the capabilities of your part of the infrastructure is just going to have to increase because you're doing more than just connecting people. I think if you're making servers and your business model depended on private data centers, then you're going to have to modify that.
Well, the name of our podcast is Watch This Space, and, we could be literal and say it's about office space, but, we're really talking about, communications technology and collaboration and, future of work. But it just says so much about, literally the space in which we work is such a big part of all of this transformation that's going on.
Yeah, and one of the things I find very interesting is that there have been these companies that have come to the fore, like Leaseman, and Delos is another one that's more focused on pure wellness, that really have a pretty sophisticated scoring system that they can go out to a company's employees and stakeholders and really get a lot of good data and then compare it in terms of the quality of like a sophisticated model of quality in the workplace and the quality of the experience. And it's starting to be more well known. So where I see this going is that there's going to be sort of a ranking of places to work on this axis, as well as just the company management itself, more of a Glassdoor traditional type of ranking. I think there's going to be sort of a rating that you get along axes related to how you run your space, like what kind of a place are you to work.
Yeah, more so than just pure culture or reputation, right?
Right.
Yeah,
and that's going to be another factor in terms of recruiting people. I mean, that's the logical extension of, what the Silicon Valley companies started to try to do with the Googleplex and Facebook and Apple. But it's not so much their model everywhere as just analyzing how people work, how you retain them, how you hire them, and what makes some place a better place to work. And that's all, and that's kind of spills over into all the stuff we talk about too.
Yeah. You a few months ago, Chris, you steered me to Leaseman, and I did get their current study or one of their current studies, and I wrote a couple of posts about it. And it's very granular, detailed information about all these attributes that they rate. And it was really interesting because one of the big takeaways to me was this idea about open office spaces work very well for some kinds of environments and tasks, but not very well for others.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, John. And I think what that reflects, the way that this is beginning to play out is you'll go to a conference like Future Offices and you'll hear, smart thinking real estate people who now can get their hands on quantitative data. They're not just listening to, we're sort of futurists, so I'm not knocking futurists, but they're listening to they're looking at more of a concrete framework of determining what to do. And they're looking at methodologies that either their own people can do or they can hire somebody to do to break people's work patterns into profiles and then compare those profiles to a very large database of people in global markets. And so I think that's what's helping to drive this multiple ways people work and how does space and technology adapt to that. It's driving that from sort of the forward-thinking director of innovation types to corporate real estate and, CFO and HR and, very concrete sort of places where you need to have an ROI, you need to have an analytical framework, you need to be quantitative, you need to show them numbers. And that's a big big break from where we were a couple of years ago, I think. I don't know if you agree, but that's what I think.
Yeah, yeah. It just shows the, evolving impact of, cloud and AI type of technologies where it's all about, decisions are being very data driven now. And that's not going to change. So whoever's got the most data, the best data is going to drive drive the biggest changes in investments. So, it all adds up for me. It's, as you say, it's a very different model. But numbers tend to carry the day for a lot of things. So that's, if it works and translates into a happier environment for people and more productive, then it's great. But if it forces people into boxes to do things that they don't really feel comfortable doing, that's a different challenge.
Agreed. And speaking of new technologies, what about you? You've been to this voice event, and it sounds very interesting. So why don't we talk about that for a bit?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So, you and I attended an event last summer in New Jersey called Voice Summit. And I attended a conference that's kind of a cousin to that event called Project Voice. And the starting point for this one is it was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So the first question is, who goes to Chattanooga for a tech conference? And this is one of these, it's kind of a locally run project, this Project Voice run by a guy named Bradley Metrock, who was a local there. And his view is, well, why not Chattanooga? So it's a bit of a, sometimes conferences get interesting. It's a little bit like South by Southwest. You wouldn't normally think about Austin as a cool place to go, but it's become like the cool place to go now. And I think they're trying to do a bit of that there. But there is some underlying reality. The local utility, EBP, several years ago, built out I think the biggest and certainly the fastest broadband infrastructure in the U.S. So that's kind of the claim to fame of Chattanooga as a tech hub, so to speak. So in terms of residential anyways, rolling out fiber to the home, that was a big deal early on. And they've kind of carried that mantle as to say, we are a tech-friendly community. We've got the infrastructure, so come on down. And, it's a little bit like, some of these southern cities like, Nashville, Lexington, Kentucky, that aren't big cities, but they're kind of smallish, up and coming. They're family friendly. They're not expensive. Quality of life is good. Education is pretty good. So there's a lot of things that are attractive, for companies to go to. So they're trying to kind of amplify that vibe there. So Chattanooga as itself, very cool place for other things, particularly music and sort of a lot of natural beauty around there too. But, as my first time going there. But interestingly enough, you know what? It certainly is working because they had tons of A-list sponsors there, Samsung, Google, Amazon, Mercedes-Benz, National Public Radio, NPR. So they had some pretty big names, putting their money behind this show. And, so the conference itself had some really great content, mostly consumer oriented, but one of the reasons I was there was to provide a little more of the enterprise side of where voice technology is going with AI. And sidebar, of course, we got our band, the Siptones, to play there. That was another draw for me to go. That's another conversation, but we sure had fun. But I will just hit a couple of highlights here because it's just so interesting when you're in a world that is more consumer oriented. You don't go there with expectations about, what's going to be the latest in, meeting room technologies and video conferencing and all that. Nope. It's mostly about, how that consumer market works. But I'll tell you, when you see the innovation that is happening, we may have talked before about Samsung with Bixby, their voice assistant, but, Amazon makes the most noise as usual. And just I want to hit a couple of points there from one of the talks. Jeff Blankenberg was from Amazon talking about what's the latest with them. The skills database for Alexa has doubled in the last year from 50,000 to 100,000. That is a lot of kind of capabilities. A lot of it may be pretty small time stuff, but the fact is it's growing really fast. And the big one that hit me is that he said there's been over 100% increase in skill engagement. And what that means is that people are doing more with Alexa than just asking for the weather or what's the traffic like today. It's becoming so much a part of the everyday life of what they're doing now. So as usage grows, trust grows, the engagement gets deeper, it does more things, and it becomes all of a sudden a part of your everyday routine. That's not news, but it's interesting to see how kind of deeply embedded this is becoming. And it's not just that gadget on the desk. Echo Buds now you put in your ear, so you don't even have to talk to a smart speaker. They have a ring that you can wear on your finger. This is so Dick Tracy, right? You just have to speak to it. And of course, it's deeply embedded into the car now. So every modality you can think of where you could use voice, is there. So it's going to become so much like an ambient experience. You'll just talk and there'll be some device out there you'll be able to connect to. And, it's not a huge leap to see how this could eventually find its way into the enterprise as a way, to access your files, to start a meeting, to communicate with somebody, whatever. It's all going to be there. So it's, Amazon's betting big on the enterprises, we know. So it's not really that far away. And so the takeaway to me, Chris, is that this is a great example of how consumer innovation usually leads enterprise adoption. So what's happening in the consumer space, I think, is a pretty good bellwether for what we can expect to see, in the not distant future at all in the workplace.
I agree, John. That's really interesting, where it's going. I think that it kind of fits into what we've said before on many planes, which is that you can't have futuristic stuff at home past a certain point where it doesn't propagate into the workplace, because not only do people not want that, and it doesn't make any sense, but it also, the workplace and the home are not so much different anymore.
Yeah, blurring of.
Yeah, but I think, if you see, it isn't even only Alexa. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but for example, once people make the jump to Siri, I see more and more people interacting with phones with Siri. And since Apple has enhanced that, and for example, it becomes more and more helpful when you're driving, I see more and more people doing that, and the Android equivalent of it, or comparable to it, in that mode too. So you're right. It's like something's going to be listening to you, or you can choose to have something listening to you, hopefully, not be forced to, no matter where you are. And that's just going to be the main way you deal with machines.
Yeah. And, I hate to say it, but privacy will eventually become a casualty along the way. It's just going to be all consuming. And another cool takeaway, Chris, is that it's not just voice. It's also vision recognition too. And they had an example here, Alexa in particular, where they showed an example of how blind people are using Alexa to help with their everyday life. So you can ask Alexa, you're holding something in your hand, say you're in a grocery store, but you don't know what it is because you can't see it. You ask Alexa, what am I holding? And its vision recognition, just like speech recognition, is good enough. It will tell you that's a box of Cheerios. It costs $4.99, and now you know what you have. I mean, I think a really profound kind of leap in where these technologies go. You start talking about, you mentioned earlier, inclusivity in the workplace, catering to people who may have disabilities of some kind. That's pretty good.
Absolutely. And you can envision that going further. Right? So let's take the example of the sight impaired or visually impaired. You can communicate an awful lot of information with voice. So maybe that's that intermediate step between now and when they do figure out directly how to feed into the optic nerve from sensors. So you could envision that you could have an application that might be sort of narrating your way along, coupled with vision recognitions, and kind of explaining what's going on, and adding that dimension of sight to help people. with any kind of visual impairment to just translate effectively visual to audio.
Yep, yep. And we certainly see it in cars, right, with the rear view and helping with parallel parking. And, those are all examples of vision-based sensors and AI and just how, when the machines get to be as good, if not better than us, we're entering a whole other environment.
Even when we're not quite there yet, there are definitely some intermediate phases of all of it where it's actually helpful.
Yeah. And again, as we become more comfortable with these technologies and they become more embedded in our day to day, we don't think about it, before you know it, you're depending on these things. And as that skill set grows with these devices, it does more and more things, and for better or worse, it's here. So I think we should leave it at that for now, Chris. For everything we're talking about, there's like probably 10 more takeaways we could hit on for both of the events we were at. But we got to keep everyone on the edge of their seat because we want you coming back, giving us a call, and we'd be happy to talk more. But I think we got to call time, Chris, because otherwise we'll be here all day, huh?
Absolutely, John. Absolutely. Once we get going, you and I, it's always the clock can get away from us. So, as always, thanks to our listeners for bearing with us. We always welcome to hear from you. And I will get together again in a month, I guess.
Yeah, we sure will. Okay. So, Chris, you signed off, and I'll sign off as well. Jon Arnold here, and it's another edition of Watch This Space. And yes, we'll be back with another one next month. Over and out for now, and we hope to hear from you soon, and we hope you enjoyed our conversation today.
Thanks, everyone.